Does America really have a godly heritage?
Did you realize that most of the 55 founding fathers who worked on the Constitution were members of Orthodox Christian churches, and many were even evangelical Christians? We don't hear that part of our history anymore.
This 1856 Maryland history textbook contains a story about George Washington that you've probably never heard. It's a story of how Washington's life hung in the balance for over 2 hours and how that only by the direct intervention of God was it spared. We'll get to this story in just a moment. This story of George Washington once appeared in virtually every student text in America, but hasn't been seen in 40 years. This story deals with George Washington when he was involved in the French and Indian War as a young man of only 23 years of age. The French and Indian War occurred 20 years before the American Revolution. It was the British against the French, and the Americans sided with the British, and most of the Indians sided with the French. Both Great Britain and France disputed each other's claims of ownership along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. Both of them claimed the same land. Unable to settle the dispute diplomatically, Great Britain sent 2,300 hand-picked veteran British troops to America under General Edward Braddock to rout the French. The British troops arrived in Virginia, where George Washington was colonel of the Virginia militia, and he and 100 Virginia buckskins joined General Braddock. They divided their force, and General Braddock, George Washington, and 1,300 troops marched north to expel the French from Fort Duquesne, now the city of Pittsburgh. On July the 9th, 1755, only 7 miles from the fort, while marching through a wooded ravine, they walked right into an ambush. The French and Indians opened fire on them from both sides. But these were British veterans. They knew exactly what to do. The problem was they were veterans of European wars. European warfare was all in the open. One army lined up at one end of an open field, the other army lined up at the other end. They looked at each other, they took aim, and they fired. No running, no hiding. But here they were in the Pennsylvania woods with the French and Indians firing at them from both sides, from the tops of trees and from behind rocks and from under logs. But when they came under fire, the British troops did exactly what they'd been taught. They lined up shoulder to shoulder in the bottom of that ravine, and they were slaughtered. At the end of 2 hours, 714 of the 1,300 British and American troops had been shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians had been shot. There were 86 British and American officers involved in that battle, and at the end of the battle, George Washington was the only officer who had not been shot down off his horse. He was the only officer left on horseback. Following this resounding defeat, Washington gathered the remaining troops and they retreated back to Fort Cumberland in western Maryland. They arrived there on July the 17th, 1755, and the next day, Washington wrote a letter to his family explaining that after the battle was over, he had taken off his jacket and had found 4 bullet holes through his jacket, yet not a single bullet had touched him. Several horses had been shot from under him, but he had not been harmed. He told them, "By the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I've been protected beyond all human probability or expectation." Washington openly acknowledged that God's hand was upon him, that God had protected him and kept him through that battle. However, the story does not stop here. 15 years later in 1770, now a time of peace, George Washington and a close personal friend, Dr. James Craig, returned to those same Pennsylvania woods. An old Indian chief from far away, having heard that Washington had come back to those woods, traveled a long way just to meet him. He sat down with Washington, and face to face over a council fire, the chief told Washington that he had been a leader in that battle 15 years earlier, and that he had instructed his braves to single out all the officers and shoot them down. Washington had been singled out, and the chief explained that he personally had shot at Washington 17 different times, but without effect. Believing Washington to be under the care of the Great Spirit, the chief instructed his braves to cease firing at him. He then told Washington, "I've traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle." That account appeared in American history textbooks for nearly a century and a half. Today, it has disappeared. There are so many things that we no longer hear today. For example, we're now told that our founding fathers were atheists, agnostics, and deists. But consider this statement by John Adams. "The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. I will avow that I then believed, and now believe, that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God." Now that's a strong statement, right to the point.
One of the many proofs of John Adams' claim is found in this book by the American Tract Society.
The American Tract Society, which today still publishes gospel tracts and gospel literature for soul winning, evangelization, etc., existed in the early 1800s. In 1813, they bound their individual tracts together to make Volume 1 of the American Tract Society tracts. While it is fascinating to read these Bible tracts and the messages they contain, it's even more fascinating to note the authors of these gospel tracts. Several of the tracts were written by founding fathers who signed our founding documents. Another founder with succinct declarations about the role of Christianity in American government was John Quincy Adams. However, before examining what he said, consider education as it was at the time of the founders.
The New England Primer was the first textbook ever printed in America. It was introduced in Boston in 1690, and for 2 centuries, many in America learned to read from this book, which today we would call a first-grade textbook or a first-grade reader. But they didn't have grade levels then, so they simply called it a primer.
It began with the alphabet. It showed students how to make 1 and 2 and 3-letter syllables, and then how to put those syllables together to make words. And then later, about a fourth of the way through the book, they returned to the alphabet, and they attached a phrase to each letter of the alphabet, and the students read the phrases and memorized those phrases. Notice the phrases that comprise the alphabet of America's schools for nearly 200 years, and note that every one of these phrases is a Bible verse. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. B, better is a little with fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. D, do not the abominable thing which I hate, saith the Lord. E, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God, and on it goes verse after verse.
This was the alphabet of many American schools for 200 years.
In the back of the book, there were several questions. Now remember, this is a first-grade reader. These are first-grade questions. What's the 5th commandment? What's forbidden in the 5th commandment? What's required in the 6th commandment? What's forbidden in the 6th commandment? And many similar questions.
This was the foundation of many American schools for 200 years.
John Quincy Adams went through this type of educational system, as did most of the founding fathers. And when John Quincy Adams was 14 years old, under this system of education, he received a congressional diplomatic appointment overseas to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia as secretary to an ambassador. Can you imagine sending a 14-year-old overseas today to officially represent the United States in Russia? John Quincy Adams had a lengthy and a distinguished political career. He served as foreign ambassador under Presidents George Washington and John Adams, as Secretary of State under President James Monroe. He served as a U.S. representative, a U.S. senator, and as the nation's 6th president. In a speech on July the 4th, 1837 at Newburyport, he asked the crowd, "Why is it that next to the birthday of the Savior of the world, your most joyous and most venerated festival returns on this day, on the 4th of July?" That's a very appropriate question. Why is it that the 4th of July and Christmas were our top 2 holidays in America? John Quincy Adams answered that question. Is it not that in the chain of human events, the birthday of the nation is indissolubly linked with the birthday of the Savior? That it forms a leading event in the progress of the gospel dispensation? Is it not that the Declaration of Independence first organized the social compact on the foundation of the Redeemer's mission upon earth? That it laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity? And on he goes for the next 60 pages. John Quincy Adams stressed that the biggest victory won in the American Revolution was that Christian principles and civil government would be tied together in what he called an indissoluble bond. But today we hear just the opposite. Today we're told that the founders wanted separation. That's not what he said. Other significant founders were outspoken about their Christian beliefs. For example, John Jay, the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and one of the 3 men most responsible for the Constitution, he declared, "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty, as well as the privilege and interest, of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers." Now, how long has it been since we've heard that type of statement from the Supreme Court? But was John Jay competent to offer such a statement? Yes. He was the original Chief Justice and one of the 3 men most responsible for our having the Constitution today. And he said that we should elect Christians for our rulers. George Washington's farewell address is yet another aspect of our heritage which has disappeared from student texts. His farewell address once appeared as a separate school textbook for over a century. Students were taught that Washington's farewell address was the most significant political speech ever delivered to the nation. And why not? He's the father of the country. He spent 45 years of his life in public service, everything from commander-in-chief through 2 terms as president. He's the man who was president of the convention that gave us the Constitution. He was the president of the United States who called for the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights, and he was the man who oversaw its formation. Certainly, he knew the intent of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In his farewell address, he reminded America what had brought us to success and warned us what must be done to continue it. Yet, amazingly, his farewell address has not been seen in most textbooks for nearly 4 decades. Why? Doesn't Washington have anything to offer the nation today? No, apparently the problem with his farewell address today is its religious emphasis. For 4 of his dozen or so warnings to the nation were overtly religious. It is interesting to note that in the last 5 years, his farewell address has begun to reappear in college textbooks, minus those 4 religious warnings. In his farewell address, Washington pointed out that the 2 foundations for political prosperity in America were religion and morality, and that no one could be called an American patriot who ever attempted to separate politics from its 2 foundations. Washington explained, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Washington believed that if an individual attempted to separate religion and morality from politics, that he could not be called an American patriot. These type of statements we do not hear much anymore, but such were the statements of America's founders, the statements of America's history. Our founding fathers delivered to us a system of government which has enjoyed unprecedented success. We are now the world's longest ongoing constitutional republic, 200 years under the same document and under one form of government. That's an accomplishment unknown among contemporary nations. For example, Russia, Italy, France, and other nations underwent revolutions at about the same time as the American Revolution, but with very different results. Consider France. In the last 200 years, it has gone through 7 completely different forms of government. Italy is now in its 51st, yet we're still in our first. Where then did our founders acquire the ideas that produced such longevity? Other nations certainly had access to what our founders utilized, yet evidently chose not to. From what sources did our founders choose their ideas? This question was asked by political science professors at the University of Houston. They felt, and rightfully so, that they could determine the source of the founders' ideas if they could collect writings from the founding era and see whom the founders were quoting. The researchers assembled 15,000 writings from the founding era, no small sample, and searched those writings. That project spanned 10 years, but at the end of that time, the researchers had isolated 3,154 direct quotes made by the founders and had identified the source of those quotes. The researchers discovered that Baron Charles Montesquieu was the man quoted most often by the Founding Fathers, with 8.3% of the founders' quotes being taken from his writings. Sir William Blackstone was the second most quoted individual, with 7.9% of the founders' quotes, and John Locke was third with 2.9%. Surprisingly, the researchers discovered that the founders quoted directly out of the Bible 4 times more often than they quoted Montesquieu, 4 times more often than they quoted Blackstone, and 12 times more often than they quoted John Locke. 34% of the founders' quotes came directly out of the Bible. The study was even more impressive when the source of the ideas used by Montesquieu and Blackstone and Locke were identified. Consider, for example, the source of Blackstone's ideas. Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws was first introduced in 1768, and for the next 100 years, America's courts quoted Blackstone to settle disputes, to define words, and to examine procedure. Blackstone's Commentaries was the final word in the Supreme Court. So what was the significant source of Blackstone's ideas? Perhaps the best answer to that question can be given through the life of Charles Finney. Charles Finney is known as a famous revivalist, minister, and preacher from one of America's greatest revivals, the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. Finney, in his autobiography, spoke of how he received his call to the ministry. He explained that having determined to become a lawyer, he, like all other law students at the time, commenced the study of Blackstone's Commentaries on Law. Finney noted that Blackstone's Commentaries not only provided the laws, it also provided the biblical concepts on which those laws were based. Finney explained that in the process of studying Blackstone's Commentaries, he read so much of the Bible that he became a Christian and received his call to the ministry. Finney's personal life story clearly identifies a major source of Blackstone's ideas for law. So while 34% of the founders' quotes came directly out of the Bible, many of their quotes were taken from men, like Blackstone, who had used the Bible to arrive at their own conclusions. Numerous components of our current government can be shown through these early writings to have their source in biblical concepts. For example, the concept for the 3 branches of government can be found in Isaiah 33:22. The logic for the separation of powers was based on Jeremiah 17:9. The basis of tax exemptions for churches was found in Ezra 7:24 and many other examples. This biblical heritage was so well understood during the early years of the nation, and the writings of the numerous founding fathers were so well known, that in later years the Supreme Court ruled in the founders' intention, keeping biblical principles as the basis. For example, notice this ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1892. The court said, "No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation." What would lead the court to conclude that we are a Christian nation? This case was not long, only 16 pages in the court records, but the court provided 87 different historical precedents to support its conclusions. The court quoted the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Congresses, the acts of the state governments, and so on. At the end of 87 precedents, the court explained that it could continue to cite many additional precedents, but that certainly 87 were sufficient to conclude that we were a Christian nation. Keep in mind that the court provided 87 precedents in this case. This is important because the courts based their decision on precedents. To the court, it is important to go back and examine both history and rulings from previous cases so that the court can continue to be consistent in its present rulings. We'll return to the importance of precedents a little later. In 1844, a school in Philadelphia announced that it would teach its students morality, but not religion. It believed that it didn't need Christianity in the Bible, that it could teach morality without them. Sounds just like schools today. This policy, among others, caused this case to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. Some of the justices on the court at this time had been appointed by James Madison. Notice what the Supreme Court told that school. "Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools, its general precepts expounded and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament?" The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that schools would teach Christianity and the Bible, the source of morality. Today we hear just the opposite. Few realize that today's rulings by the court often repudiate rulings delivered by the Founding Fathers themselves. In 1811, a court made a ruling which was subsequently cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. That court declared, "Whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government." Although this case dealt with a man who went into a profanity fit, profanity wasn't the problem. It was the intent of his profanity. For it had not been a moment of anger or a temporary loss of control, but it was a deliberate and a planned act. He had even taken the time to write it out and distribute it. In that writing, he had maliciously and capriciously attacked Jesus Christ, declaring that Jesus Christ is so-and-so, or God is so-and-so, or the Bible is such and such, continuing through a string of accusations and profanities against Jesus Christ and the Word of God. The court explained that the problem with his writings was that an attack on Jesus Christ was an attack on Christianity. An attack on Christianity was an attack on the foundation of the country. Therefore, an attack on Jesus Christ was equivalent to an attack on the country. This man was sentenced to 3 months in prison and a $500 fine for attacking the country by attacking Jesus. And notice the date of that case, 1811, nearly 2 decades after the First Amendment was in place. The First Amendment never intended to separate Christian principles from government. Yet today we so often hear the First Amendment coupled with the phrase separation of church and state. The First Amendment simply states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Obviously, the words separation, church, or state are not found in the First Amendment. Furthermore, that phrase appears in no founding document. While most recognize the phrase separation from church and state, few know its source. But it is important to understand the origins of that phrase. What is the history of the First Amendment? The process of drafting the First Amendment made the intent of the founders abundantly clear, for before they approved the final wording, the First Amendment went through nearly a dozen different iterations and extensive discussions. Those discussions, recorded in the U.S. Congressional records from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, make clear their intent for the First Amendment. By it, the founders were saying, we do not want in America what we had in Great Britain. We don't want one denomination running the nation. We will not allow all to be Catholics or Anglicans or any other single denomination. We do want God's principles, but we don't want one denomination running the nation. This intent was well understood, as evidenced by court rulings after the First Amendment. For example, a 1799 court declared, by our form of government, the Christian religion is the established religion, and all sects and denominations of Christians are placed on the same equal footing. Again, note the emphasis. We do want Christian principles, we do want God's principles, but we don't want one denomination to run the nation. Thomas Jefferson, to whom the now popular phrase separation of church and state is attributed, also believed, as did the other founders, that the First Amendment simply prevented the federal establishment of a single denomination, a fact he made clear in a letter to Benjamin Rush. In that letter, Jefferson committed himself as president to not allowing the Episcopalians, the Congregationalists, or any other denomination to achieve what Jefferson called the establishment of a particular form of Christianity. So what is the source of Jefferson's now infamous phrase? On November the 7th, 1801, the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut wrote Jefferson concerned that the guarantee of the free exercise of religion appeared in the First Amendment. To them, this suggested that the right to religious exercise was a government-granted rather than a God-granted right, thus implying that someday the government might try to regulate religious expression. They believed that freedom of religion was a God-granted, unalienable right, and that the government should be powerless to restrict religious activities unless, as the Baptists explained, those activities cause someone to, quote, work ill to his neighbor. Jefferson understood their concern. In his response on January the 1st, 1802, he assured them that the free exercise of religion was indeed an unalienable right and would not be meddled with by the government. Jefferson pointed out to them that there was a wall of separation between church and state to ensure that the government would never interfere with religious activities. Today, all that is heard of Jefferson's letter is the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, without either the context or the explanation given in the letter or its application by earlier courts. The clear understanding of the First Amendment for a century and a half was that it prohibited the establishment of a single denomination. National policies and rulings in that century and a half always reflected that interpretation. For example, in 1853, a group petitioned Congress to separate Christian principles from government. They desired a so-called separation of church and state, with chaplains being turned out of Congress, out of the military, etc. Their petition was referred to the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees, which investigated for almost a year to see if it would be possible to separate Christian principles from government. Both the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees returned with the reports. The following are excerpts from the House report delivered on March the 27th, 1854. The Senate report was very similar. The House report said, had the people, the Founding Fathers, during the Revolution had any suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and its amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one sect, denomination. The report continued. It said, in this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. 2 months later, the Judiciary Committee made this strong declaration. It said, the great, vital, and conservative element in our system, the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and the divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The committees explained that they would not separate these principles, for it was these principles and activities which had made us so successful. They had been our foundation, our basis. During the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, yet another group which challenged specific Christian principles in government arrived before the Supreme Court. Now, Jefferson's letter had remained unused for years, for as time had progressed after its use in 1802, and after no national denomination had been established, his letter had fallen into obscurity. But now, 75 years later, in the case Reynolds versus the United States, the plaintiffs resurrected Jefferson's letter, hoping to use it as an issue to their advantage. At that time, the court printed a lengthy segment of Jefferson's letter and then used that letter on separation of church and state to again prove that it was permissible to maintain Christian values, principles, and practices in official policy. For the next 15 years during that legal controversy, the Supreme Court utilized Jefferson's letter to ensure that Christian principles remained a part of government. Following this controversy, Jefferson's letter again fell into disuse. It remained silent for the next 70 years until 1947, when in the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court, for the first time, did not cite Jefferson's entire letter, but selected only 8 words from it. The court now announced, the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. This was a new philosophy for the court. Why would the court take Jefferson's letter completely out of context and cite only 8 of its words? Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology and a strong opponent of religious principles in government and education, perhaps explained the court's new strategy when he stated, there is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. This statement precisely describes the tact utilized by the court in the years following its 1947 announcement. The court began regularly to speak of a separation of church and state, broadly explaining that this is what the founders wanted, separation of church and state. This is their great intent. The court failed to quote the founders. It just generically asserted that this is what the founders wanted. The courts continued on this track so steadily that in 1958, in a case called Bear versus Colmorgan, one of the judges was tired of hearing the phrase, and he wrote a dissent warning that if this court did not stop talking about separation of church and state, people were going to start thinking it was part of the Constitution. That warning was in 1958. Nevertheless, the court continued to talk about separation until June the 25th, 1962, when in the case Engel versus Vitale, the court delivered its first ever ruling which completely separated Christian principles from education. The court struck down school prayer. Even the World Book Encyclopedia 1963 yearbook noted that this case was the first time that there had been a separation of church and state in education. In the 1962 case, the court redefined the meaning and application of a single word, the word church. For 170 years prior to that case, the word church, as used in the phrase separation from church and state, was defined to mean a federally established denomination. However, in 1962, the court explained that the word church would now mean a religious activity in public. This was the turning point in the interpretation of the First Amendment. Understand what the court has just announced. No longer would the First Amendment simply prohibit the establishment of a federal denomination. It would now prohibit religious activities in public settings. This current doctrine of separation is a brand new doctrine. It is not something from the Founding Fathers, and it is not in any founding document. Even outside observers recognize that this policy is a recent one. Yet notice how much has been relinquished in recent years under this new doctrine. School prayer was the first casualty of the redefinition of the First Amendment in the 1962 Engel case. School prayer had never before been challenged, for clearly school prayer had never established a national denomination and therefore had always been acceptable. But under the new definition, school prayer definitely was a religious activity in public and was therefore now deemed to be unconstitutional. That 1962 case, which first redefined the First Amendment and then removed school prayer, was notable in a number of aspects. Recall that the 1892 Supreme Court case offered 87 precedents to maintain the inclusion of Christian principles in our laws and our institutions. Well, this 1962 case, which removed school prayer, was just the opposite. It was the first case in court history to use 0 precedents. The court quoted 0 previous legal cases, and without any historical or legal base, the court simply made an announcement. We'll not have prayers in school anymore. That violates the Constitution. A brand new direction was taken in America. Within a 12-month period of time, in 2 more cases in 1963, the court had not only removed prayer, but also Bible reading, religious classes, and religious instruction. This was a radical reversal. A book from 1946 illustrates this. This book is titled Bible Study Course of the New Testament for Dallas High Schools. On the cover page, it explains that this book was authorized by the Board of Education on April 23, 1946, and it was printed in the Dallas Public Schools print shop. The introduction further explains that this was a credit course toward graduation in Dallas high schools. Now, this wasn't a bland course on the New Testament. Lesson 1 begins with the Gospel of John, chapter 1, and studies the pre-existence of Christ. Now, notice the questions based on John chapter 1. Where was Christ before he was born on earth? What titles does John apply to Christ in this chapter? For what purpose was John sent by God? Name 5 things the angel told Mary concerning her child Jesus. What does the word Jesus mean? How did the angel explain the miraculous births of John and Jesus? And continues right on through the lesson. At the end of lesson 1 is memory work. Memorize the pre-existence of Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. This was a textbook for public schools in 1946. What had occurred in the 1962 and 63 rulings was a radical reversal of national policy prior to that point. It was in the Abingdon v. Shemp and Murray v. Curlett decisions on June the 17th, 1963, that the court not only reaffirmed its ban on school prayer from the previous year, but further reached out and banned school Bible reading. Recall that in the brief survey already presented, the founders relied on the Bible, early textbooks quoted the Bible and used it as part of the alphabet, and earlier Supreme Court cases ruled that a school must teach religion in the Bible. Therefore, on what possible basis can the 1963 court justify its ruling to stop the use of the Bible in schools? The court always explains its decision in written form. That 1963 case was no different. If you go to a law library and examine the text of that decision, you will find why the Bible had to be removed from school. In its written decision, the court noted that, quote, if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. Now that's quite a statement. For the second time in a year, this was a case lacking both historical and legal precedent. Again, the court simply made a new announcement of policy: no more Bible reading in schools. The courts continued to extend the new boundary outward. In 1965, in the case Reed v. Van Hoven, the court determined that it was possible for students to pray over their lunch at school so long as no one knew they were praying. They couldn't say words or move their lips, but they could pray if no one knew about it. In 1967, in DeKalb versus Despain, the court took a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class and declared that nursery rhyme unconstitutional. The court explained that although the word God was not contained in this nursery rhyme, if someone were to hear the rhyme, they might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. This trend continued in case after case, year after year. In 1 year alone, 3 cases made the courts challenging the right of students to see copies of the Ten Commandments while at school. The Supreme Court accepted the Stone v. Graham case from Kentucky, where a copy of the Ten Commandments was hanging in the hallways of the schools. The court acknowledged that the Ten Commandments were passive displays. That is, they simply hung on the walls just like a picture of George Washington. They were not part of any class or any curriculum. They just hung there. A student could look at them if he wanted to, and if he didn't, fine. Yet notice the court's ruling under the redefined First Amendment. The court said, if the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible objective. That's quite a statement. You can't let kids see the Ten Commandments because if they do, they might obey them. Things like don't steal, don't kill, and that would be unconstitutional. When the court declares something unconstitutional, it is inferring that our founding fathers, the men who drafted the Constitution, would have opposed it. Yet notice what James Wilson had to say about this. James Wilson was a signer of the Constitution, an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and co-author of America's first commentaries on the Constitution. Certainly he's qualified to speak to the intent of the Constitution, and he explained, human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other. The divine law forms an essential part of both. Our founders were clear about the important and inseparable role that religious principles played in the public life of the nation. The entire controversy over God and religious activities and teachings in school had begun with the 22-word prayer in the Ingle Vitale case. That 22-word prayer, the prayer that led to the removal of all prayers from America's schools, simply said, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That prayer, which only acknowledged God and didn't even contain the word Jesus, was a bland prayer. It was so bland that 8 years later, when a court was discussing that prayer, it described that prayer as a, quote, to whom it may concern prayer. That bland prayer acknowledged God only once. That one acknowledgement of God is the same number of times that God is acknowledged in the Pledge of Allegiance and only 1/4 the number of times that God is acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence. Yet it was unconstitutional. Since this simple prayer acknowledged God, the court went so far as to find out what percentage of the nation did believe in God. In the 1963 case, Abingdon v. Shemp, the court reported that only 3% of the nation professed no belief in religion, no belief in God. 97% of the nation believed in God. That prayer was consistent with the beliefs of 97%. Nonetheless, the court took another first. It sided with the 3% against the 97%. This was the first time in America's history that 3% had become a majority. 3% had always been a minority, but now the philosophy of the 3% would be the philosophy under which the 97% must conduct its affairs. The 4 categories in that prayer which petitioned God's blessing were students, families, schools, and the nation. There are numbers of court cases readily available which show that until 1962-63, the courts consistently ruled using biblical principles and following biblical guidelines in all 4 of those areas. For example, in the area of families, even in 20th century divorce cases, a court explained that divorce was allowed for very few reasons, and that the reason was because the Bible allowed very few reasons. The court pointed out that it had not made the family, God had. Therefore, it didn't have a right to regulate something it had not made. The courts even went into a Bible lesson. It explained that in the beginning, God had made Adam and Eve. God made the first family, and then the court continued through a history of God's dealings with the family, concluding that since it was God who had created the family, the court would use His rules in dealing with it. The same policy not only held with the court's rulings on families, but also in the court's rulings on the nation, schools, and students as well. But in 1962-63, the Supreme Court reversed that position and announced that those rules and policies caused, quote, psychological damage. Did the court's decision to change national policy and to separate God's principles from its rulings have any effect? Let's examine each of the four categories, beginning with students. That which occurred with students following the removal of religious principles was perfectly predicted by George Washington in his farewell address when he said, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Washington warned that to remove religious principles would be to lose national morality. Notice the accuracy of his warning. This chart shows pregnancies for unwed girls ages 15 through 19. For decades prior to 1962-63, birth rates for unwed teen girls had remained relatively stable. However, with the court's separation of religious principles from students, birth rates for unwed girls have now increased every year since 1962-63. This chart represents pregnancies for high school girls, but even birth rates for girls 10 through 14 years old have increased 553% since the removal of religious principles. This is a strong correlation. Perhaps it's merely coincidental, but it is both complete and striking. It is further significant to note that every moral measurement which exists for students breaks violently upward with the separation of religious principles from the lives of students in 1962-63. Notice this category: sexually transmitted diseases to high school students. Notice how low sexually transmitted diseases had been. Notice the point when religious principles were prohibited. Notice a dramatic increase. The same is true for every moral measurement among youth. Again, each of these categories was showing overall declines prior to 1962-63, but with the first ever separation of religious principles from students, a violent upturn occurred on every chart and in every moral measurement. Washington was correct. The next category over which God was acknowledged in that simple prayer, in which the courts had maintained the use of biblical principles prior to 1962, was that of our families, or our parents. What happened when we abandoned the use of God's principles when dealing with families? Consider the area of divorce. Statistically, the divorce rate had been steadily declining for years and even decades prior to 1962-63. Beginning in 1963, the divorce rate skyrocketed. The United States has now become #1 in the world in the rate of divorce. It is again striking that every measurement related to the breakup of the family statistically skyrocketed in 1963 with the separation of biblical principles from public policy. Single-parent families are now up 140%. Single-parent families with children are now up 160%. Even family morality is dramatically different. Unmarried couples living together are now up 536%. Again, each of these categories had been stable for years prior to 1962-63, and then the dramatic increases correlate exactly to the court's rejection of those standards which had been applied to the family for 170 years previously. The third category in which God's assistance was petitioned was our schools. What happened when we barred God and His principles from our schools? The SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, is an excellent indicator. The SAT test has been in America since 1926, and in 1941 it was placed on the same scale that is still used today. Prior to 1963, there were never more than 2 consecutive years where the scores either rose or declined. But beginning in 1963, scores plummeted for 18 consecutive years. Unprecedented. Scores are now so low that the Department of Education states that this is the first time in America's history that we are graduating out a generation of students who academically know less than their parents did. The SAT test is the same test their parents used. It's been the same since 1941, yet there is nearly an 80-point difference between the two generations. In 1962, there were only 1,000 Christian schools in the nation, but once it became obvious that things like prayer, Bible, and the Ten Commandments would be forbidden, there was a marked explosion in the number of religious and particularly Christian schools. By 1984, the number of Christian schools had burgeoned to 32,000 schools. Currently, 8.5 million students, approximately 12% of the student population, attends private religious schools. According to the board responsible for the SAT test, the scores of students from private schools are nearly 80 points higher than those from public schools, which places them at the same level of scores prior to 1962-63. For private religious schools, it's as if no change had ever occurred. But for public schools, their scores are still continuing to decline. Another indicator of the impact that religious principles and religious schools have had on American education is found in the academic cream of the crop, the nation's academic elite, the national merit semifinalists. These are the top 0.5% of the nation's students. Now, according to the Department of Education, 12.4% of the nation's students attend private religious schools. 87.6% attend public schools. Since 12% of the nation's students attend private religious schools should produce 12% of the nation's cream of the crop, and 88% of the nation's students in public schools should produce 88% of the nation's cream of the crop. Yet that is not what is occurring. For example, in recent testing, that little group of 12.4% of the nation's students from private religious schools was producing 39.2% of the nation's top academic scholars. That's a level 3 times larger than its size. That's a phenomenal differential. We showed these statistics to a U.S. congressman. He looked at them and stated, "That makes perfect sense to me," he said. He said, "When you're talking about private schools, you're talking about money. You're talking affluency." He said private schools ought to get better scores than public schools. We investigated to see if that would be true and found that according to the Department of Education, the average private school costs $2,200 per student, while the average public school costs $5,400 per student. Private schools, with 2/5 the funds, are proportionally turning out a percentage of academic scholars 3 times higher than public schools. But consider, what is the fundamental difference between public and private schools? It is not in the core curriculum. The curriculum is the same. The Civil War takes place the same year at both schools. Math is the same at both schools. A verb is not an adjective simply because someone transfers to a private religious school. The basic difference is that one school utilizes religious principles and one does not, which appears to make an 80-point difference on the SAT test. The final category, the 4th category, was our country. What happened in the nation when we separated religious principles from public arenas? Well, what do you think happens when you start telling students, you can't see the 10 Commandments, you might obey them? Things like don't steal and don't kill. That has to have an effect on behavior. It did. Washington, in yet another warning from his farewell address, accurately predicted what has occurred. He said, "Let it simply be asked, where is the security for life, for reputation, and for property if the sense of religious obligation desert?" The sense of religious obligations has deserted, and currently there now seems to be no security for life, for reputation, or for property. For example, consider violent crime. After having remained statistically stable for years, since the removal of religious principles in 1962, the number of violent crimes has now surpassed population growth by 794%, causing the United States to become the world's leader in violent crime. Perhaps the best explanation for this increase was given by Thomas Jefferson, who succinctly states why Christianity was the best friend to government. Jefferson explained, "The precepts of philosophy laid hold of actions only, but Jesus pushed his scrutinies into the heart of man. He erected his tribunal in the region of his thoughts, and he purified the waters at the fountainhead." Where the law says, "Don't kill," in Matthew 5, Jesus says, "Don't get angry, don't hate." Clearly, if you prevent the anger and the hate, you've prevented the murder. Where the law says, "Don't commit adultery," Jesus says, "Don't lust in your heart." If you control the lust, you've controlled the adultery. The founders pointed out that only religion could stop crime before it started, because all crime comes out of the heart, and if you can't control the heart, you can't control crime. That is why Christian principles were so valuable to government. Most of the founders expressed the same understanding. President John Adams pointed out that there was no government in the world able to make someone do what was right or able to control those who did not wish to be controlled. Adams explained, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." Then notice what he said. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The founders believed that the Constitution would work only for people who had internal restraints and internal controls, for people who would use the Word of God as their standard. We've moved away from that, and clearly the Constitution, apart from religious principles, is not working the way it should, a fact evident on all the charts and statistics. Since 1962-63, the United States has undergone marked and dramatic statistical reversals, becoming the world's leader in the most unenviable categories. The United States is now #1 in the world in violent crime, #1 in the world in divorce, #1 in the Western world in teenage pregnancies, #1 in the world in voluntary abortions, #1 in the world in illegal drug use, and #1 in the world in illiteracy. Of all industrial nations, we have the highest illiteracy rate. A White House briefing recently reported that just 3 years ago, 700,000 students graduated from high school who, after 12 years of school, were unable to read their own diplomas. Looking at the list of categories that we now lead, Jeremiah 6:16 has some good advice. It instructs us that if we want the ways of peace, go back to the old paths. But what were the old paths? Once the Founding Fathers had declared themselves independent from Great Britain, they immediately faced the task of establishing new state governments. Prior to the Declaration, all the state governments had been British-run with British Crown governors. By breaking from Great Britain, the states lost their governments. So after signing the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers returned to their home states to establish brand new state governments. Look at what the Founding Fathers, the men who had signed the documents, placed in their own state constitutions. For example, notice Delaware. The other states were very similar. Everyone appointed to public office shall say, I do profess faith in God the Father, and in the Lord Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God and blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. This was not a requirement for seminary. It'd be wonderful if it were. This was a requirement to be a politician, a requirement set up by the Founding Fathers themselves. But notice that this requirement is consistent with the First Amendment because it did not require someone to be from one specific denomination to hold public office. It did not say you had to be a Methodist, a Lutheran, a Catholic, an Anglican, a Presbyterian, or a Baptist, but it did say that you had to understand God's principles. You had to understand the Word of God to hold office. The different state constitutions contained several common components. For example, notice the requirements in Pennsylvania and Vermont constitutions. The other states were very similar. And each member of the legislature, before he takes a seat, shall make and subscribe the following declaration. I do believe in one God, the Creator and Governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked. In other words, a politician must acknowledge his understanding that when he left office, he wouldn't just answer to the voters, he would be accountable to God for what he had done while in office. He would answer to God himself. This concept of individual accountability to God is well understood. It is broadly accepted that we will answer to God in the future. The founders, however, took this principle a step further. It was clear that an individual answered to God, but did a nation also answer to God? The Founding Fathers believed that it did. On the floor of the Constitutional Convention was explained the difference between individual accountability to God and national accountability to God. An individual answers to God in the future, but not a nation. When a nation dies, it is forever dead. It will not be resurrected in the future to answer for what it has done. Therefore, when does a nation answer to God? George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, explained, as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. The founders believed that God would deal with the nation right now, in the present, for the stands that it takes. A nation has no other time to answer to God than the present. Perhaps this is the best explanation of why all the charts broke dramatically in 1962-63, when for the first time in the nation's history, we officially told God he was no longer welcome in the public affairs of this nation. The charts simply illustrate a principle the founders understood, believed, and discussed. Supporting examples are found throughout the Bible. For example, the story of Elijah in 1 Kings. After he won his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel, he went to Mount Oreb where he complained to God, "Get me out of here. I'm the only one left. There's no one else in the nation who believes in you." And God responded, "There's 7,000 men in this nation, men of integrity, righteous men, men who do love me and who have not bowed their knee to Baal." Yet what was occurring in that nation? Ahab and Jezebel were the nation's leaders. They were wicked leaders. Because of their wickedness, because of the bad stands taken by the nation's leaders, the entire nation, including those 7,000 righteous men, went for 3.5 years with no rain. You see, God had to deal with the nation based on the stands of the nation's leaders, despite the fact that there were righteous individuals in the nation. Another example is that of David in 1 Chronicles. David decided to number his troops. He'd won so many victories that he came to the point where he thought, I win victories. I'm a strong king. I want to see how big my armies are. His general, Joab, tried to reason with him. David, don't number the troops. God is the one who wins the victories. It's not the size of your army. But David persisted. No, I want to see how big my army is. I want to know how strong I am. Go number my troops. There was a bad stand for the nation's leader to say, God, you haven't won the victories. I've won the victories. As a result of that stand by David, a plague came on the entire nation, and in Jerusalem alone, 70,000 people were wiped out in one day. You see, a nation does account and will either suffer or be blessed for the stands of its leaders. This is why the founders were so emphatic about keeping men in office who understood God's principles. And perhaps the most famous speech ever delivered by Benjamin Franklin, delivered on Thursday, June the 28th, 1787, on the floor of the Constitutional Convention, Franklin reminded the delegates that we needed God to be our friend, not our enemy. We needed him to be our ally, not our adversary. We needed to make sure that we kept, as Franklin called it, his concurring aid. Franklin warned, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? He said, we've been assured in the sacred writing that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. And thus Franklin called for regular daily prayer to make sure that we kept God in the midst of what we were doing in the nation. Jefferson, too, understood this principle. Jefferson declared, and can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice cannot sleep forever. A nation does answer to God for the stands it takes. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, overheard someone in the White House state that he hoped that God was on our side in the battle, that God was on the Union side. Lincoln, showing that he understood the principle of national accountability, replied, "Sir, I'm not at all concerned about that, for I know that the Lord is always on the side of the right. But it is my constant anxiety and prayer that I and this nation should be on the Lord's side." This understanding of national accountability to God has been part of our heritage, part of our history. Our founders understood that a nation needed to take stands which lined up with God's principles so that God's blessings and His concurring aid, as Franklin described it, could rest on the nation.
Elias Boudinot, who served as president of the Continental Congress, made a recommendation which sums up what must again happen in America. He said, "Let us enter on this important business under the idea that we are Christians on whom the eyes of the world are now turned. Let us in the first place humbly and penitently implore the aid of the Almighty God whom we profess to serve. Let us earnestly call and beseech Him for Christ's sake to preside in our councils." He was saying, do you want to be a world's leader? Then put Christian principles in your public affairs.
Recall Charles Finney? Finney said, the church must take right ground in regard to politics. Politics are a part of a religion in a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. God will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics. Why is this true? Can a nation be blessed apart from God's principles? No. But where do God's principles reside? They reside in the hearts and the lives of God's people. If God's people do not get involved, God's principles do not get involved. The ungodly will not run a nation by godly principles, and God can't bless ungodly principles. That's why the church has to take right ground. That's why the founders were so emphatic about keeping Christian men in office, an emphasis evident from the first Supreme Court justices to the individual state constitutions. Today, we cannot afford to be isolationist. We can't say, I'm not going to get involved. We must realize that we need to get involved. For God's principles do not enter any arena on their own. They enter only through God's people. Proverbs 18:1 says, "A man who isolates himself seeks his own desires. He rages against all wise judgment." The founders used to teach their young people, young people, do you want to do something good for God? Then be a senator, be a judge, a congressman, a doctor, a lawyer, a missionary, or a pastor. But get out there where you can affect people with God's principles. But in the 1940s and the 1950s, we began to say in America, young people, do you want to do something good for God? Then be a missionary or be a pastor, but don't get involved in politics. When we started getting out, we handed the system over to ungodly principles. We've got to get involved again. We have to come to grips with the fact that separation of church and state, as we have it today, is not in the teaching of the Founding Fathers. It is not a historical teaching, and it is not a teaching of law until recent years. We also have to realize that the current version of separation of church and state is not a biblical teaching. Separation says, okay, Christians, we recognize that you're the light of the world, just don't get out of the church. Don't shine on anything outside the church. Or Christians, we recognize you're the salt of the earth, but don't get out of the shaker. You see, separation of church and state says you can be salt and you can be light, but only inside the four walls of the church. That's not scriptural. We can't do that. We further need to recognize the fact that there is going to be someone's religion in schools and in government. For example, in 1961, in the case Torcaso v. Watkins, and again in 1985, the courts ruled that secular humanism was a legitimate religion, equivalent to Christianity under the law. Secular humanism, by the court's recognition, is a viable First Amendment religion. Now, secular humanism has a religious philosophy which very simply says that God has no place in their philosophy. It is a religious philosophy based on men, not on God. The court has recognized it as a religion. In 1977, in the cases Theriault versus Silber and Malnick v. Yogi, the court said that atheism was a religion. But how can atheism be a religion if it doesn't believe in God? Whatever you believe with all of your heart, whatever affects the way that you act, whatever you believe so strongly that it changes your behavior, that is your religion. So what is the religion of atheists? The religion of atheists, the thing that affects the way they behave, is that they believe with all their heart that there should be no religious practice. Therefore, the religion of atheism is the religion of practicing no religious practice. It is religiously practicing non-religion. Furthermore, people may now give contributions to satanic groups and get the same tax deductions as people who give contributions to Christian churches. But consider, when do we hear separation of church and state? Have you seen anyone go into a school at Halloween and say, "Wait, get those witches down off the wall. Separation of church and state. I demand separation. Witchcraft is a legal, organized religion"? Or have you seen anyone go into public schools and say, "Now wait, I don't see any prayer here. I don't see any Bible reading here. There's no religious practice here. That means it's a religion of atheism here. I demand separation of church and state. Get the religion of atheism out." No, we don't hear that. When do we hear separation of church and state? Anytime there's an attempt to involve Christian principles. Separation of church and state is the big club pulled out to beat back the Christians. We have lost ground in recent years as we've lost our understanding of the founders' intents and teachings. We do have a godly heritage in America, but we've been robbed by the 3%. Separation of church and state, as we have it today, is not a biblical teaching. It is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers. It is not a historical teaching, and it is not a teaching of law until recent years. The 3% has taken away our heritage. We've lost sight of it. We have to get involved and take it back. A godly heritage is the foundation of America, and the church must take right ground. We must recover the things that we've given up in recent years. We must get involved.
Experience more of America's rich spiritual history through the award-winning videos, books, audio tapes, and other exciting materials available to you from Wall Builders. The powerful video, The Spiritual Heritage of the United States Capitol, brings to life the exciting history of our nation's most cherished landmark. Featuring the only complete Capitol tour footage in existence, plus dramatic historical reenactments, it's an unforgettable journey through great events and lives that help shape our nation. Keys to Good Government provides valuable insights from great leaders in American history on the desperate need for integrity in the lives of public officials. For a different view of the Revolutionary War, see The Spirit of the American Revolution. You'll learn of miracles that happened in battle and discover the true inspiration for victory. Education and the Founding Fathers examines the beliefs of our early leaders on the use of the Bible in schools, at odds with the prevailing notions held by many educators today. The Foundations of American Government takes a look at the powerful effect of biblical principles at work in public life and the statistical downturn our country has made in the absence of these ideals. All of these titles are available on audio cassette, as are a number of other presentations by David Barton. In addition, don't miss these Wall Builders book titles: America, To Pray or Not to Pray, Benjamin Rush, Original Intent, and The Bulletproof George Washington. And reprints such as Ethics, an Early American Handbook, Lives of the Signers, Noah Webster's Advice to the Young, the 1777 New England Primer, Documents of Freedom, and many others. Also take a look at Wall Builders' Great Americans Poster Series. All are available at P.O. Box 397, Aledo, Texas 76008, or call 817-441-6044 for more information. To place an order, call 1-800-873-2845 and visit our website at wallbuilders.com.